Okay, does everybody see at least the presentation view here?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So again, appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody tonight. My name is DJ Vlaming. I'm president and co-owner of the Arizona office for Association Reserves. I've been in the reserve study business for about 27 years, and I've been here in Arizona on the ground since like 2003. I moved out here. Um, and this evening, I'm going to talk to you about reserve study basics. There we go. So this is basically going to help you better understand the concepts and terminology we use in the reserve study, which is going to help you understand the results of the reserve study and interpreting, you know, how good it is or what to tell your board members. So first and foremost, what is a reserve study? Well, a reserve study is a planning document and a budgeting model. Its purpose is to help associations prepare for significant irregular expenses over time while minimizing or avoiding surprises and special assessments. Having a reserve study is important because asset deterioration and the expenses that come from that deterioration are inevitable. The only question is, how prepared will you be? A reserve study helps you avoid being surprised by an expense that was gradually approaching over the last 10 or 20 years. So we don't want our nice clubhouses and buildings looking like this old rundown barn. And so it takes some significant planning and funding to keep them maintained. And I'm going to talk about some other reasons that encourage regular reserve planning. Governing documents, they typically empower and require the board to collect funds that adequately provide for major common area expenses. Generally accepted accounting principles is often referred to as GAAP, and these are standard accounting practices across all 50 states. They call for associations to annually balance the physical deterioration of the common areas with a sufficient amount of cash to ensure the association is on track to replace its assets. Now that's basically a reserve study. And state laws. Working with clients across the country, we found there's around 30 states now that have laws requiring some level or frequency of reserve studies. I'm going to ask the question. I'm not sure what the best way is to get an answer, but does Arizona have a law requiring reserve studies? No, I see heads shaking no. Correct. We don't, at least not yet. But does that mean you're not required to have one? Now, I have two answers for that. First, you need to check your governing documents because they might require it, in which case it's still going to be a requirement, right? Second, the board has a fiduciary duty to the membership of the community. So if the association does not have a current reserve study to help plan for significant expenditures, then I would say the board is not upholding its duty. So in that respect, an association should still have a reserve study, even though the state doesn't require it. Then there's the fundamental practical need for information. The boards and management need a periodic status update on the association's major upcoming expenses and its ability to pay for them. Now, while the reserve study may sometimes appear overwhelming, they can be anywhere from 10 to well over 100 pages if you've looked at one. But all that data really boils down to just three key results. A list of what you're reserving for is your component list. This is the foundation of your reserve study. A measurement of reserve fund strength is what we call percent funded. And then a plan to prepare for the expenses on that component list is your funding plan. So those first two results establish where you are now, like a current status. And the third is a recommendation of where to go from here. So when you're reviewing your reserve studies, make sure you can identify those key results. Now we're going to review those reserve study results by first looking at the component list. Now, the component list forms the foundation of the reserve study. The other results are all based on the component list, so it's important that it be current and credible. Your reserve fund is not a catch-all for any expense, and your reserve study is not going to account for every potential expense the association may face. So how do we know what should be included on the component list? National Reserve Study Standards outlines this four-part test to help determine if an asset or expense is appropriate for reserve funding. So first and foremost, any asset or expense in question must be a common area maintenance responsibility of the association. The asset must have a limited life expectancy and it must have a relatively predictable remaining life. But now predictability is very important when it comes to reserves. So I extend predictability to scope of work and cost. We need to be able to reasonably anticipate when the project is going to happen and how much it's going to cost in order to incorporate it into the funding plan. Then finally, cost of the asset must be above a minimum threshold cost. That means the cost should be too large to be easily absorbed into the maintenance budget. The threshold cost, or level of significance, if you will, is custom for each community, and it's going to be impacted by factors such as community size and budget flexibility. So we typically look to the board and management to help determine what's a good threshold for your community. And most of the clients we work with have a threshold in the range of $1,000 to $3,000. At this point, those are insignificant for a lot of communities, and I won't even budget for anything that costs less than $1,000 anymore. But as an example, if you had a $2,000 expense threshold and there's a community asset that meets the first three criteria but costs less than $2,000, it's not going to be budgeted in the reserve study because that cost level has been deemed insignificant. So the assets funded in the reserve study are going to vary depending on the type of community we're working with and its common area responsibilities. But here's some examples of typical items you'll see in a reserve study. We see a lot of private streets and parking lots, pools and related items such as decks, furniture, fencing and equipment, playground equipment and other recreational amenities, painting for walls, fences, and buildings, and roofing on common buildings. As I mentioned, reserves are not going to account for every potential expense the association may face. So what items are typically not included? Well, items that are unpredictable, meaning they have an unknown useful life, an unpredictable remaining life, an unknown scope of work and cost. Now, the most common items that fall under this category are electrical wiring and plumbing. And for a lot of our communities, plumbing also means irrigation. These items are underground, they're in the walls, and generally not accessible to inspect and evaluate and quantify. So they're outside the scope of a reserve study. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be included. For example, if your landscaper says, hey, your irrigation is becoming more problematic, we're spending a lot more time and money on repair, so you should plan to either replace it or rehab it in the next 3 to 5 years for $100,000. We can plug that in and schedule it for you. We just can't give you those metrics to tell you how much to budget and when. Also, items with extended or indefinite life expectancies are not going to be funded in the reserve study, such as buildings. We're not going to budget to replace clubhouses and condo buildings. Annual expenses are more appropriately included in the operating budget, regardless of how much they cost. If it's something that's occurring every year, it should be an operating expense. Then small, insignificant expenses are inappropriate to be funded through reserves, which is why we established that expense threshold I talked about a couple slides ago. So now that we know the four-part test, and we know what's typically included in the reserve study and what's typically not, we set out to conduct an inspection of the community to compile the component list. Now, this is also known as the physical analysis portion of the reserve study. During this process, we look over the community to identify those assets that are going to be included in the reserve study. We attempt to evaluate their condition based on visual observations. So let's take a look at some examples we see during inspections. Water on a roof? It never rains in Arizona, right? However, that big monsoon storm is going to hit right when your roof is in poor shape and can't handle it. Now, is this roof going to positively or negatively impact curb appeal and property values? Some people think you never have to paint stucco, but I'm not sure about that. If the exterior of your home or common buildings look like this, I don't think your property values would be maximized. And have you ever heard that asphalt never needs to be repaved or replaced? I remember board members all the time saying that the city never repaves its streets, so why should we be budgeting for this? I'm not sure where they're driving because everywhere I go, it seems like the city's constantly repaving. But this picture here is a good example of failed asphalt that does need to be replaced. Now, sometimes we find communities where current members are no longer interested in playing tennis, so they just stop maintaining the court. Now, if I were interested in purchasing a home in this community and saw this tennis court while driving around, I have to seriously reconsider buying in that community. I think this is a red flag that says either the community doesn't have enough money to maintain a tennis court or they have low maintenance standards. So this is still a common area amenity that either needs to be maintained, or if there's no interest in using it, perhaps it just needs to be removed. Now here's a sample component list that's compiled after inspection of a community. We've gone through the process, we've looked at everything, and every asset that we're going to fund in reserves is identified on this list with a scheduled useful life, remaining life, and current cost. This is the final result of our physical analysis. Now, once we have all this information compiled, we can then move into the financial analysis portion of the reserve study. So before I continue, it looks like there might be some comments in the chat. Are there any questions? Oh, you can see it. Thank you. Okay. If anybody does have questions, we can, interrupt me. We can go through it, or we can hold them to the end. So it's your choice.
Is paint for the exterior, would that go on the component list?
Definitely. I mean, assuming we're talking about at least a sizable painting project, because again, if it falls under that cost level of significance, yeah, it's not going to be included. But painting is one of the bigger components that we do fund on a regular basis, especially if you have extensive view fence or perimeter walls, or even the condo buildings themselves are very expensive to paint.
Things with
and then
pools.
We have one question in the chat now. Would dry well maintenance typically be reserve component? They're saying it's about $1,600 annually for them. Would something like that be factored in?
I do budget for drywall clean out. If you're budgeting, or if you expect your cost is going to be about $1,600 a year, then it should not be in reserves. Again, it goes back to what I was saying as an annual expense that's more appropriately included in the operating budget. But if you have a good number of dry wells, they don't need to be cleaned out every year. So we'll generally budget some kind of an allowance in the 3 to 5 year range to do all or a percentage of them, depending on how many there are. Anything else for right now?
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Joe. How do you analyze street maintenance in terms of life expectancy and the impact like a slurry seal will have? I see a lot of, I'm a real estate broker. I see a lot of HOAs use a slurry seal and then they're trying then to say that the slurry seal will last 20 years, which I think is a 3 to 5 year solution, isn't it?
Right. Slurry seal is basically a Band-Aid for failing old asphalt. It's basically a new wearing surface that gives a little bit of more thickness to fill in, imperfections and rough spots and things like that. So it definitely is not a 20-year application. It's not a regular maintenance application either. Like I said, it's something you're doing at near the end of life to try to extend the life. Normally, especially if we're working with a newer community, we have a scheduled life expectancy. We do budget to repave the streets or the asphalt at some point, and we're generally budgeting to seal coat, which is different than slurry seal. But a seal coat is a maintenance application that helps prevent oxidation, and that's going to help the pavement last at least the anticipated life expectancy, if not a little bit longer. So we're generally budgeting a major repave and a seal coat.
Seal coat, okay. And what's the cost differential between a slurry seal and a seal coat?
I don't budget for slurry much, but my last recollection, I'm throwing a number out here, but I'm thinking it's like double or triple the cost of a regular seal coat.
Okay,
And
yeah, that's what I figured.
And it
And
should,
what,
a good slurry, depending on the condition of the underlying asphalt, the slurry might last somewhere in the 6 to 8 year range. And
Mhm.
I've been told in the past, a slurry is almost like an overlay. Like I said, it's a new wearing surface. So even though you put a slurry down, you're still going to want to seal coat the slurry because you want to try to keep, all the rock or the pieces in there bound together and not oxidate too quickly.
yeah, we're in the middle of our reserve study. And I think the big issue has been the streets. We're 25 years old. The prior streets were all cracked and looked about the same as our slurry sill 1 year later. It's like, oh, this is really, and the slurry sill I think is in 5 years will look like this, it needs to be replaced
Right.
all over.
Yeah, because all that cracking that you're trying to cover, it's going to reflect right back through the slurry seal pretty quickly. Even if you went a step further and did an overlay, which is a new layer of asphalt, maybe 1 inch, 1.5 inches thick, without taking out the old asphalt, all those cracks are still going to reflect back through that new layer within a couple of years. So it's only delaying the inevitable.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of time. I've been working hard to analyze, are we going down the right road with our current slurry sill, and whether it's worth spending any more money on it.
Yeah,
Okay.
we've done some analysis. One of my colleagues did. Sometimes there's recommendations for a lot of slurry seal and skin patching and all these different applications just to try to extend the life, but spend so much on these repairs that end up spending more over the long term instead of just repaving.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, I'm looking at it as a waste of money.
Yeah, it can be. So you want to try to start saving up so when that slurry wears out, you're ready to repave rather than put another slurry down or an overlay.
Okay, so someone mentioned HA5, a product in the contents.
HA5 is a really good product, but if your asphalt's already at the point of failing, it's too late to start using it, in my opinion.
Right.
It's something that if you do repave, you'd want to start using it because it's supposed to better preserve the asphalt. Plus, it lasts about twice as long as a regular seal coat, so you're disrupting the community less often. So I really like it in that respect.
HA5, yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think you're in the middle of our Belmont and Triple Crown.
Okay,
So,
great.
cool.
This is Bill Hagemeyer from Greenway Estates. I've got a question regarding pools.
Okay.
I noticed I'm just recently on the board here, and I've noticed that there's a pretty good sized crack protruding through the deck of the pool, not going into the water or cracking into the water area, but it is in the deck. Eventually, I mean, cracks eventually get bigger, they don't get smaller, So I mean, it seems like maybe this might be something we should be reserving for.
Is it a concrete deck or like a acrylic deck coating, or what do you have?
Well, it's probably a concrete deck, I think, but there may be some sort of a coating on the surface. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I just noticed that, the other day when we were doing a walk around, we had a bit of, that's a pretty good sized crack in there, and some discoloration on the bottom of the pool because we've had issues with the pool guy not doing his job.
Yeah, with the typical deck that we see out here, it's going to be a concrete deck with an acrylic coating.
Mhm.
And generally, we're not budging to replace the deck. It's more resurfacing that coating on a longer term basis with a shorter term like seal or repaint. Certainly, when you get to the point of a major resurface, they're going to scrape off all the coating, and that's when they might either do some kind of a patch or replace that piece of concrete. But it usually wouldn't be a full deck replacement.
Okay.
Let's see, there's a question here in the chat. It says reserve analysis was completed in 2018. Prices have changed a lot since then. Is it safe to say a certain percentage increase in pricing, or should we have a new study done? It's hard to say what a certain percentage would be in pricing because there's a lot of the prices move differently, but I don't even want to throw a number out there. They've increased a lot. As we'll get to later in the presentation, we'll talk about how often the study should be updated, but the study for 2018 is very outdated at this point in time, even if we didn't have excessive inflation. So certainly you want to get it updated.
This is Rich Moore with Sierra Verde Ranch.
Hi.
My question, are reserves for rainy day or for long-term maintenance, things that you don't cover on the annual basis?
Yeah, they're definitely not rainy day. I've heard that a lot, especially in my earlier years. They're not emergency funds you're saving. They're being saved for specific projects, longer term stuff that you're not planning or you can't really budget in your operating account, or your operating budget.
In addition to those items that you know about, though, is it advisable to have almost like a slush fund for things that come up? In other words, undesignated, the money's not designated, but sometimes shit happens and you have to come up with something.
Right.
Should you be in the normal budgeting process adding a little extra every month in to make sure that you can cover these things as they come up?
I think that's great if the association can afford it. Now, that wouldn't be part of the reserve study because the reserve study, you need to have it scheduled. But like when you have communities that are collecting money at the close of escrow for all the homes sold in the community, and a lot of times they allocate either a portion or all of that money to reserves, but a lot of times they also keep some of it aside as a capital improvement fund. And so that would be a great source to set aside for, if you want to call it capital improvement or working capital. But certainly, as you mentioned, there are going to be things that come up. And even I indicated a couple slides back that the study's not going to account for everything. Mm-hmm. It would be good to have a slush fund or some kind of emergency fund for unforeseen expenses.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. How does a low reserve balance affect a subdivision? Is there a negative impact on financing and community values or community values? Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in the next section of the presentation, but certainly a low balance is not good. I think as it brings about cash flow problems, which then is going to lead into deferred maintenance because you can't afford to do things, which is going to affect the curb appeal, which is then going to ultimately affect the property value. More and more buyers are becoming savvy about reserves. So you might have somebody that wants to see the study ahead of time. And if the reserve balance is low or the funding status is low, they're either not going to want to buy there or they're not going to want to pay market value. So that's becoming a bigger issue. Banks, especially FHA financing, I don't know all the details there, but I know they look at reserves, they look at the percentage of the contributions, a percentage as your overall budget that's going to reserves. And so they have some strict criteria they're looking at. And I heard they just revised the criteria last month, and it's a little bit more strict than it used to be. So they're certainly looking at it and determining whether or not they're willing to lend at different communities. I think that's a bigger deal with our condo communities than your single family home communities. Oh, that's an interesting comment. Says I purchased my home in 2019. Due to low reserves, I had to double my down payment. That's one I haven't heard. I don't know. Is that a bank insurance issue? Like it's they're worried about you defaulting because maybe the community is deemed not stable. Interesting though. I haven't heard that one before. All right. Well, let's move on. If we have some more questions along the way, we can stop again, and we also will have time at the end. So I want to get into this part here, and the second reserve study result is a measurement of reserve fund strength. And I want to take a look at how to do that. And so fortunately, this is a pretty simple concept, and I'm illustrating with an example of a $10,000 expense that occurs every 10 years. Now you can see the expense is flat. I've eliminated inflation to keep the illustration simple. So the question is, how much money should the association have in the bank to prepare for this recurring expense? Now, it's a trick question. I don't know if anybody wants to take a guess, but in this case, it's kind of hard to participate too much. So I'll tell you, the answer is, it depends. Because it depends which year you're in. In the years approaching the expense, your reserve fund should be growing closer to the estimated cost. And once you complete the project, you start the cycle of saving all over again. So it's simply a matter of having the amount of funds on hand equivalent to the component's deterioration. So if your component is half used up, you should have half of the replacement costs on hand. So looking at the numbers in this example, half of the life being used up means the component is 5 years old. And we should have saved $5,000 at this point. Now, if we did save $5,000, then we're on track to have the money we need by the end of year 10. If we have less than $5,000 at this point, then our saving plan needs to be altered in order to accumulate more than $5,000 over the next 5 years. Now, this concept is called the fully funded balance. The fully funded balance is a benchmark balance of how much an association should have saved in its reserves at a point in time. It's defined as the fractional age of a component multiplied by its current cost. Now, this same formula is applied to all the components to get a fully funded balance total for the association. Now, this fully funded balance is calculated and reported annually, typically for the start of each fiscal year. I do want to point out, I mentioned how it's calculated with the fractional age of the component. So this is a moving target because every year your assets are getting older. The fully funded balance is growing because those assets are moving closer toward replacement. But when you start the site, when you start replacing assets, it renews them, and it so has the effect of reducing the fully funded balance. Now here you can see the fully funded balance calculation for this set of reserve components. So remember, this represents the deterioration or the accumulating reserve needs of the association at a point in time. It does not reflect the total replacement value of the reserve components. So you can see there are different components here with varying lifespans, different remaining lives, and all different costs. So you have a variety of different items that are occurring at different times, but all that data boils down to estimating this association should have about $154,000 in its reserve fund. Now, once we've calculated this figure, we can then calculate reserve fund strength and determine, is this community in good shape, poor shape, or what do we have to do going forward? Now, percent funded is a reserve fund strength indicator. It measures how well reserve funds match the association's needs. Now, the percent funded calculation is very simple. It's just the ratio of the actual reserve fund balance to that calculated fully funded balance we just talked about. Now, we've divided percent funded as a measure of reserve fund strength into 3 ranges. 0 to 30% funded is the weak range. 70 to 130% funded is the strong range. That middle area between 30 and 70% funded is considered fair. So percent funded can be looked upon or thought of similar to a credit score since it measures risk. We'll come back to that question with the financing. So it's an evaluation of risk. It provides a quick evaluation of an association's financial health. If you have a basic understanding of these percent funded ranges, you can pick up any reserve study, look at the percent funded, and generally know if the association is financially strong, fair, or weak. Now here's where you can see why we have those percent funded ranges. This graph illustrates the relationship between percent funded and special assessment risk. So notice that as percent funded goes down, special assessment risk goes up, and quite a bit. In that 0 to 30% funded weak range, special assessment risk averages 37%. That means associations in this range have a better than 1 in 3 chance of needing a special assessment that year due to lack of sufficient reserve funds. At the other end of the spectrum, you can see special assessments are rare among associations with strong reserves over 70% funded. Now, if you're wondering how associations compare, here's a national profile compiled from about 25,000 reserve studies. You can see that most associations are in that middle fair range, but there are plenty of others both in the red weak range and in the green strong range. It's a mistake to think that all associations are poorly funded and that no association could ever afford to be well funded. The entire spectrum exists. So what are consequences of a weak reserve fund? Well, special assessments. I mean, that's the main issue we hit on all the time, right? Special assessments should be avoided because they're just inherently unfair to a very select group of owners. Another consequence is deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance means owners are putting up with cracks in the pavement, maybe leaking roofs or peeling paint, kind of a declining curb appeal. And at its worst, deferred maintenance can lead to a serious decline in property values. So let's look at some examples of deferred maintenance. So is this a jacuzzi or a mud bath at a day spa? Now, this would be a major red flag if you were walking this community and considering purchasing a home here. You know, if they can't keep the spa maintained and running, that's a concern. Now, this is a nice looking secure lounge. I don't know if you noticed, but it's on a roof. My concern, in addition to it being on a roof, is that it's got a lot of broken straps. As association members, board members, we need to really be concerned about liability if someone gets hurt on this type of deal. Now, why do we need to maintain balcony decks? Now, originally this is kind of in here as a funny picture, but this has really become a serious safety issue across the country. There have been multiple balcony failures, and people have died and other people have been severely injured. It's gotten to the point where California created legislation requiring communities to have a structural engineering inspection, I believe every 9 years. So they've got to go through and have a percentage of the decks, or any kind of, doesn't have to be balconies, it can be elevated walkways, but they have to have them inspected and reviewed and certified every 9 years. And that's, as you might imagine, a very expensive procedure. So a deck inspection is now a new funded component in our California offices because we know the timing, we know it's expensive, and it has to be done. So we don't have that kind of legislation here. I would just encourage anybody that has a community with balconies like this, or especially some of the communities that have elevated common walkways or stair landings, things like that. Encourage your boards to hire a structural engineer periodically to get out there and just make sure that these things are stable. And we don't want to be retroactive on doing something after one of these things collapse and people get hurt. So the third reserve study result is the funding plan. We'll take a few minutes to look this over. National Reserve Study standards require every funding plan to be based on 4 principles. We need to create a funding plan that provides sufficient cash to complete reserve projects on time. We need to create a funding plan that has a stable contribution rate through the years. Now, this is desirable because it keeps the irregular reserve expenses from disrupting the budget. We need to create a funding plan that is evenly distributed across the ownership base, meaning it's fair to both current and future owners. And finally, we need to create a funding plan that is fiscally safe and responsible. So we got another question. Stair treads failing, yeah. That's certainly an issue, and when we have common stairways, we do like to budget an allowance to replace some of the treads, because I know, especially if you get into replacing a large portion of them, it can be very expensive. But the structural aspect of things is, as you guys probably know, being in the industry with the Florida collapse a few years back now, everyone's really focused on structural integrity. So I know in our reserve studies, I'm adding in, they're unfunded components, but I'm adding in recommendations to hire engineers, like especially if you have a parking, like an underground parking garage, so your entire building is basically sitting on that structure. So something to think about. Now, while I'm on the subject of funding plans, I want to take a moment to talk about reserve funding objectives. Now, the funding objective is more important than the funding method, like cash flow and straight line. When I first started working in this industry, that was the debate, was, you know, cash flow or straight line. But those are just tools we use to achieve the objective. So we're going to focus on objectives. So how strong do you want your reserve fund to be? And how tolerant is your association of special assessment risk? National Reserve Study Standards defines 3 funding objectives. There's full funding, threshold funding, and baseline funding. So full funding is the conservative objective to achieve 100% funded where special assessments are rare. Baseline funding is the opposite extreme, which means it has the goal to just barely keep your reserves cash positive through the years. And then threshold funding is a strategic choice of a particular percent funded target, somewhere between the full funding and baseline funding objectives. So this is what a full funding profile looks like on a percent funded graph. In this example, the association is starting at about 55% funded, but has the long-term goal to reach and remain at the 100% funded level. So notice that the association never falls into that weak, high-risk range when pursuing this objective. But the main criticism of this plan is that people believe it's too expensive and the owners can't afford it. Now, that may be true, but the reality is real estate is expensive and maintaining it is expensive, and we need to create plans to develop enough money to do that maintenance. So as somebody that creates these funding plans, though, I want to point out that it takes around 20 years in this example to achieve the full funding objective. That's not too aggressive. I don't have a short-term time frame in mind where I'm going, I need to get them from 55% to 100% in 5 years. I just want to create a nice long-term uptrend that eventually achieves that objective at some point in the 30 years that we're illustrating. Okay, now here's the same association, but we've slightly lowered the reserve contribution rate to illustrate pursuing a baseline funding objective. It still takes some pretty significant reserve contributions to keep reserves from going below zero. A baseline funding plan is still supposed to provide enough reserves to complete the association's projects on time. So don't make the mistake in thinking you can significantly reduce reserve contributions by pursuing this objective. Although it's designed to never go below zero, notice there's about 9 years in there where it falls into that weak, high-risk range. If you remember from our discussion on percent funded, that anytime an association is in this range, they have a better than 1 in 3 chance of needing a special assessment that year. There's a good chance this association will have about 3 special assessments scattered through those years. We have found on average that reserve contributions for a full funding objective are about 10 to 15% more than contributions required for a baseline funding objective. Full funding does not require 2 or 3 times the contribution rate of a baseline plan, as many might believe. I think the problem is a lot of associations aren't even contributing enough to achieve a baseline objective. So when they're faced with a recommendation for full funding, it just looks completely unachievable. And one of the biggest misconceptions about reserve funding is that contributions are for the future and only benefit future owners. But that's just incorrect. Reserve contributions offset asset deterioration that's occurring now while the current owners are using and enjoying the assets. Now, owners using the assets should pay for their use. If every owner pays their fair share of asset deterioration on an ongoing basis, the future takes care of itself. Reserve contributions are not charity for some future group of owners. Okay, I'm getting close to the end here. I'm going to wrap up with a couple of frequently asked questions, and then we'll see if you guys have any other questions. Common question is, what kind of reserve studies are there? And there's 3 main types. You'll see there's level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 is what we call a full reserve study. And this is a first-time reserve study where the component list is developed from scratch. It's the most time-consuming and comprehensive option. So if you have a good study in place, this option is only needed once. And then from there on out, it's just updated. So our level 2, I'm saying R, but this is industry terminology. Level 2 is the update with site visit reserve study. And this is where the reserve study is updated, and it involves a new site inspection to reevaluate the component list from the previous reserve studies component list. So it's not going back out there and reinventing the wheel. Now, we may add components, we may take components out, but we're generally not there to re-quantify. We're there to reevaluate conditions. And then the level 3 is an update no site visit reserve study, which we also call an NSV. Now, this study involves updating the component list from the previous reserve study. And as the name suggests, there is no site visit. So this is what you might call a paper update. People like to say we're just updating the numbers. We're not going out looking at conditions. We're just updating based on time. The managers send us the list of expenses that have occurred since the last reserve study. So we're updating what's been done and obviously new financials. So we're revising the component list based on current timeline and costs and new financials, and providing a new projection and funding plan for the association moving forward. How often should you update the reserve study? So the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and generally accepted accounting principles recommends reviewing or updating your study annually as part of the budget planning and reporting process. Now, since there is no law in Arizona requiring reserve studies or even reserve study updates, this does not mean you have to update the study annually. But management and the board should be reviewing the most recently completed reserve study every year to look at changes in the funding plan that are scheduled for the upcoming year. You guys may be aware, we do include an inflation factor in the report. So every year we're expecting the cost of these components to go up. And now to offset those increasing costs, the funding plan is also increasing annually. So you should be looking at the funding plan in the back of the report and the tables to see what is the funding plan contribution rate increasing to next year. You should also be looking at the schedule of reserve expenses. What projects are coming up next year? If it's a big project like a roof, maybe it's time to go and get an inspection to evaluate if it really needs to be done. And if it does, maybe it's time to start getting some bids. If it's a pool filter, maybe you just wait and see if it fails. That kind of review, but it's something you should definitely be sitting down and looking at every year. The update timing may also be dictated by CC&Rs and state laws. We have some states, such as California and Washington, they do have laws requiring annual updates and disclosures. CC&Rs often require an update at least every 5 years, but honestly, that's just too infrequent. So CAI's best practices and industry recommendation is to conduct a site inspection-based update every 3 years with consideration for the no site visit update during the in-between years. So in closing, I want to refer you to our website, reservestudy.com. If you're interested in learning more, we have a lot of frequently asked questions and articles about reserve study topics. We also regularly host webinars, so you can sign up and watch a live webinar. And if you can't, we have recordings of past webinars, and a lot of them are co-hosted with other industry professionals like attorneys and insurance people. So a lot of different perspectives and topics. It's not just basics like we covered here today. So definitely take a look if you're interested in learning more. So that concludes my presentation. So we'll look and see if we have more questions. And what do we have here? Okay, answer. And does a reserve study include loss control funding, E&O? I would say no. E&O is insurance. So that's, if you're referring to like the insurance premium, then no, that's an annual operating expense. And if you want to expand on that, let me know. I'm not sure how else to reply to that. Is it useful to provide vendor estimates for current condition and suggested replacement dates to the reserve study provider? Absolutely. I mean, we're coming up with our best estimates. We research with vendors. We look at what other communities have paid for similar projects. But yeah, if you have a roofer that's giving you an estimate or somebody else, and it's a project you're planning, definitely give it to us, because that's going to be the best estimate where you have somebody that's actually willing to do the work and telling you how much they'll do it for, that's going to be the best estimate. The other thing is, we work a lot with some asphalt consultants. So if the association has an asphalt maintenance plan in place where the consultants laid out when they should expect to repave and seal coat and things like that, we take that information and we try to mimic that schedule and implement it into the funding plan, because the consultants' recommendations don't account for how they're going to pay for it. They just say, here's when you need to do it and how much it might cost. So definitely share anything you have. I mean, the best reserve study are going to result from our collaboration. We're putting in our information and expertise and experience, and then anything you have that can add to it is just great information. It's going to make the report better.
I have one question, Joe. I'm wondering if is the reserve study part of the budget normally?
In terms of how much you're funding into the reserve plan?
Yeah, what funding in the reserve and how you're going to allocate expenses for future projects. So if you have a street maintenance project scheduled for next year and you're budgeting for next year, should those items be on the budget?
Right. So to go back to the first part of your question, yes, the contribution to the reserve fund should be listed in the operating budget as, I don't want to call it an expense, but it is an expense out of the assessment income that you're receiving. So we generally see that as two parts. Yeah. So that should be a part of the operating expenses. And then in the study, we lay out when certain projects are coming due. We also make a recommendation on, based on the component list, here's how much you need to be contributing to the reserve fund each month.
Last question, is it possible to get a copy of this presentation?
Sure.
Okay, good. I appreciate that.
I have a quick question, if you have a moment.
Sure.
I don't know if you're going to answer it, but how much does the reserve study cost the community?
There's no one answer there. So it's really going to depend on the size of the community. There's a cost difference between like a condominium type community versus single family home community. We look at the amenities. Is it highly amenitized or not? And then where is it located? How far are we traveling? Are we talking multiple days on site? So it's all up in the air. I've priced them all over the place. I think on average, most typical communities are going to be somewhere in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, but there are some that are a lot more expensive than that and some that are less.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Let's see. Here's a question. If your new next door neighbor is the light rail and public parking area, what can the reserve study do for me? Nothing. That's unfortunate. Right, the reserve study is a budget plan to help the association prepare to replace and maintain the assets it's responsible for. So the light rail and the public parking would not be listed in the reserve study.
Is there a percentage of the monthly HOA fees that should go to reserves, like some kind of standard or?
Well, going back to the conversation about the funding requirements for banks and FHA, my last recollection is the FHA requires a minimum of 10% of the dues assessment being allocated to reserves. In general, we find that most associations should be contributing in the range of 15 to 40% of their dues to reserves. So that's a big range, because you have some communities like condos or highly amenitized communities that have a high funding obligation due to all the things they have to pay for, or you have smaller single family home communities with few assets that don't have a very big obligation to fund. So it's really all over the board.
Mm-hmm.
One more question from Joe. Sorry to bug you guys, but does the FHA requirements and reserve requirements only apply to condos, or does it also apply to single family homes in a regular subdivision?
I am not 100% sure. The focus is primarily for condos.
Right.
But I don't know how much of it applies to single family homes.
Yeah. I can't find a good answer, and I've seen it happen where not FHA, but Fannie Mae has called an HOA to confirm, an underwriter writing a Fannie Mae loan would call an underwriter to confirm that there's enough, not call an underwriter, but call the HOA president to confirm that there is enough money there in the reserves to cover like street repair and the big capital items.
And I'm probably referencing FHA incorrectly, because I think some of the new standards I referenced that came out last month were for Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and I'm just interpreting that as FHA. So maybe they might have differing requirements.
Sure, and that's just it's a flag for realtors as well. Lack of reserves is a flag for real estate agents as well as lenders at some point. It just comes out about. Okay, good enough.
So I have a question. We have 30-year-old garage roofs, and it's past due on the reserve fund study to replace them, but we have very few leaks. We have about 100 garage stalls, I guess, and maybe 2 places that we know that it might leak every now and then, kind of.
Did you freeze, or did I miss the question?
Oh, somebody else was still in there.
Oh,
the 30-year-old garage roofs are past due on our reserve fund study. We have about 100 stalls. We might have 2 leaks every now and then. It still has the older thickness underlayment.
so because they're scheduled, you want to know if you need to replace them, or should you put it off? Is that what you're asking? You're muted.
Okay, not muted now, maybe.
Okay. Is that what you're asking? If you should do it or
Correct.
put it off? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think and it's on a garage, so at least it's not over living space, because as an association, if roofs leak and damage the interiors, now you have more expense to repair the interior. So I'm less concerned about a garage. I think if things are going fine, it might be something where, when you update the study next, you guys say, let's put this out a couple more years because there's really no problems. But as a board, I would also be more proactive in having a roofer look at them and kind of maybe trying to get a better gauge of how soon or how much longer you have before that roof expense is going to be needed. Because you definitely don't want to wait until you have a bunch of leaks and other damage.
We had a roofer come out, and he said that, we could do about $10,000 worth of repairs, and it'll hold it off for 3 or 4 years.
Okay. All right, it sounds reasonable. You budget for a repair allowance, get that done, and schedule the replacement in 3 to 4 years out.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, here we go. Reserve investments, understand considerations, most to least pricey. Our safety, liquidity, and interest rate. For roads, it seems that a longer, higher term and yield investment should be used. Investment rates at the less than the rate of inflation for purposes don't make much sense to me. What type of things should be in a capital plan that is not in a reserve study? Does that question actually pertain to the investments? But just to touch on the investments, we don't get into making recommendations on the investment end of things. We're just saying how much you should have in your reserve fund, how much to contribute going forward. But seeing that schedule of expenses helps treasurers, or if you have an investment advisor, helps you to ladder when you're going to need the bulk of your money. So you can lock some of that up into some higher interest earning investment vehicles. Certainly, though, you don't want to get risky. We don't want to risk any principal, because that's a culmination of everybody's money. So we want to be safe there. And then what types of things should be in a capital plan that is not in a reserve study? Capital plan, like a capital improvement. Can you expand on that?
Yes, I thought you had said when you were talking about the reserve study, is there some items that would not go into a reserve study, but would be a capital item that should be considered for a reoccurring budget?
I'm not sure if I said for a
Maybe
recurring budget. Yeah.
maybe I misunderstood what you said, but I thought I heard you say that there were some items that were larger expenses that would not go into a reserve study, but should be set aside for consideration.
Well, I was talking about some of the items that are unpredictable and that we don't include. And there was a question about, should there be a slush fund for some of these things? Because there's going to be expenses that come up. It's just we don't know when or how much. So I was suggesting that would be a good idea if the association has the flexibility in the budget to save some money in a capital improvement fund, or a kind of a unforeseen type fund, that kind of thing.
Could you give me an example of something that might go in that? I'm still not understanding you.
Okay. It's more, first I want to say it's something that's unforeseen. Like depending on the type of community, you may have sewer lines, water delivery, plumbing, irrigation. Those type of things are typically not going to be included in a reserve study. There can be other large unforeseen expenses that we're just not sure about at this point that could come up. So again, not everything is going to be included. So it's good to have some money set aside for when emergencies come up, whether that could even be a microburst monsoon storm that wipes out a bunch of trees, right? We're not going to be funding to replace all the trees. So it's good to have some kind of a funding source for that type of thing. When I was mentioning capital improvement in my mind, or when I reference it, is the expense to add something that doesn't currently exist. So if you have a community that wants to add a new playground, not replace an existing one, but add a brand new one in a different location, that's a capital improvement, and they should not be using reserve funds for it. But if they have money coming in, as the example I gave from closed escrow contributions for home sales, they should be allocating some of that money to that eventual expense to add the new asset.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay.
I joined late. Sorry, I had a surgery I was finishing up. Quick question. So the capital is basically to add something new. Because I am from a medical building association, basically. We have 3 buildings on Desert Foothills. I have been thinking about this, but maybe this is something that I can ask you. Because nowadays, the government is allowing to create the electric vehicle charging, like stations. If you want to add those, they pay 90% of that. Our association has so much parking, which basically doesn't ever get used after 5 p.m. So if we were to create some revenue out of that, is that a genuine thought process, or it is like ridiculous thought process?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last part of the question?
Is it like a genuine thing to do as a homeowners association to kind of consider using some of the assets of the complex to create some revenue?
I think that's reasonable. And we've seen some communities that allow cell phone towers to be installed, and they collect that revenue from the cell company to kind of add to their funding, or to help reduce funding that the owners have to pay. In regards to your example of, let's say EV chargers, now if the community doesn't currently have them, the installation would not be a reserve expense. But as you said, majority of that
Capital.
cost might be funded by the government anyways. But
Yeah.
once you install it, now it's an asset of the association, and we would add it to the reserve study for future replacement.
But have you seen, because I am from the medical building kind of scenario. So have you seen that kind of things being done in Arizona?
No, not really. I've got a couple clients I work with that have the chargers, but they're not really used as a revenue source.
And how about, a similar thing, because this is a commercial situation rather than residential, how about investing in putting like solar tops on the roof? I mean, that will help, in some way. I mean, everybody would be interested.
Right. It's the same concept. I do have a couple communities that have put in like those parking shade structures with the solar on top. But same concept where, the initial installation is not something that should be funded out of reserves, but once it's there, assuming it's owned and not leased, then we put it into the reserve study so they're saving for the future replacement of the asset.
Thank you. I appreciate your input on that. Thank you. And the process through it, because I don't know what do I do? Like, do I send it somewhere? Who do I send it to? I don't know.
The process of what?
Like, say I somehow now figure out, okay, like the Tesla charging system, say I contact somebody and whatnot, and we say, okay, we're gonna install the system. Now, I think what I know, I am the only board member and I am everything for the board in my complex. So I am the one signing it. What should be the process? Is anybody even involved in this?
I don't know. I think, well,
I'll jump in.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll jump in. So I just threw my email in the chat. If you email me, just a summary of exactly what you just said, hey, Desert Foothills, we want to look into some EV charging stations and maybe some solar options. I'll get that over to your manager, and then we can start that process with you.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so a couple more questions here on the chat. What percent increase do you plug in each year due to inflation? So this is a tricky question, although it shouldn't be. So to answer the question directly, we plug in 3% inflation into the reserve study. Now, I know that doesn't sound reasonable right now, but when we're putting together a 30-year projection, we have to expect or assume that inflation is not going to stay at the current level. So if we were to plug in even like a 5 or 6% inflation rate over 30 years, is going to just throw the funding plan out of whack. So what we do is we use high current inflation to come up with the current cost estimate, and maybe even a little bit more for the short term. And then the 3% inflation factor is increasing costs year over year for the long term. So every time we update the study, we do look at the different costs of the assets to see what we should be budgeting currently, and not just assume that it's been a 3% increase since the last 3 years. Let's see. If a common area has an issue that could cause someone to get hurt, would a consultant be able to identify? That's a good question. I mean, we are not engineers. If there's certainly a hazard that we identify, we would bring it to your attention, but we're not specifically looking for hazards or testing for those type of things. So that's where if there's a concern, or even the situation I brought up about elevated common walkways, it'd be a good idea to bring in an actual engineer or expert that looks for those type of things. I think I'm really behind on this list. So when a reserve study is be performed, does the reserve money go to the operating budget, then would cause a variance in the operating budget? Seems like it shouldn't be a variance if it is in the plan. Yeah, I don't get into the actual logistics of that. I know some people just pay it right out of the reserve fund, I've seen people where instead of transferring the money to the reserve account out of operating, they just hold it in operating because they know they're going to spend that money. So it depends on, I think, maybe goes back to how the association runs, or possibly how your management company runs things, or how they require that type of situation. All right, so for a community not gated, public streets, etc., should the study still use 30 years or fewer years? Well, the 30-year projection is standard, and actually that's National Reserve Study standards used to require a minimum of 20 years, and the new standards that they're updating require 30 years. So we need to show 30 years anyways. I get the point that with maybe not as significant of assets to plan for, that a longer term projection may not be as critical. But you know, we still do 30 years. Okay, I think that's the last one here. Did I miss anything, or does anybody else have anything to add?
Thank you. Yes, we did record. I will download and save it tonight, and it should be up on the board training website. So I'll make sure to get it out to all of the community managers so they can send it out to everyone. And then again, if you have any requests for future classes or topics, let me know, and I'd be happy to get that on the schedule for you all. DJ, thank you. This was excellent. Got a lot of thank yous in the chat too. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and as requested, I'll send you the presentation in case anybody wants it. All right, then I will head out. Good night, everybody, and thanks again.